We're going to talk all things Florida State versus Miami today on Locked On Seminoles.
You are Locked On Seminoles, your daily podcast on the Florida State Seminoles, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome back into another episode of Locked On Seminoles. I am your host, Brian Smith, and today's show is going to be a special one. I've got a guest that has covered University of Miami football for a very long time, Mr. Alex Donno. So please make sure you tune in and listen, and please comment on YouTube and anywhere else. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get Mr. Donno on the show. Alex, how you doing today, my friend? How's it going?
Brian, I'm so happy to be here, even in enemy territory. Probably not going to be the most popular guest you've had on, but I'm thrilled to be here. And the Miami versus Florida State rivalry means a lot to me. I know we're going to talk about it. Believe it or not, I've got FSU alumni in my own family, so
really?
The family reunions the family reunions get pretty exciting around game time.
All right, buddy. I appreciate it. Well, today's sponsor is LinkedIn Jobs. It is a recruiting sponsor here on this show, and I appreciate LinkedIn being a sponsor for us. Obviously, you and I talk a lot of recruiting pretty much daily in one way, shape, or form. So check out LinkedIn Jobs. It is the best place to get your hiring needs taken care of. All right, Alex, I just want to get this out of the way, make a couple quick comments, and I want your opinion on it. The grant of rights is something that is I had Kenton Gibbs from All ACC or Locked On ACC yesterday. We discussed all the things about what could happen, the numbers that he's heard. He's certainly more well-versed than myself. Here's my question. Forget the numbers. That stuff is infuriating to try to follow. If it did happen at any point in time that Florida State made the jump, in your opinion, do you think Miami would want to follow, whether it's the Big Ten or SEC? It would be obviously one of the two. And if they did, why do you think so?
Yeah, and I can only give you my personal opinion on it because Miami's been so quiet, frustratingly quiet.
Unbelievably so, yes.
Polar opposites from Florida State. I mean, Florida State, obviously, the lawsuits, they've been so vocal about wanting to get out of the ACC. I get the sense that Miami and a lot of others within the ACC are just sitting back to kind of let Florida State be the ones to try and break down that wall. And then if they find a way out of the grant of rights, then others could follow suit. Of course, Clemson and North Carolina had been other schools that had been reportedly a little bit more vocally interested in getting out of the ACC than Miami. Miami's been very quiet, so I have to wonder why. Is Miami maybe less confident than some of these other schools that they would get a bid from the Power 2? I mean, Florida State seems to be pretty confident that they'd land on their feet, whether it be Big Ten or SEC. Is Miami less confident of earning an immediate bid? I don't know, but that's something that I wonder about. But bottom line is, Brian, why I think Miami would be and should be interested if Florida State finds a way out of the ACC. You really don't want to be left behind in a conference that loses Florida State and potentially loses Clemson and North Carolina as well, because what exactly then are you left with? I mean, first of all, the problems as to why Florida State wants out of the ACC to begin with would still be there, and that's the diminished TV revenue. I mean, the television shares that ACC members get when you compare it to the TV deals of the SEC and the TV deals of the Big Ten, the ACC schools have one hand tied behind their back from a revenue standpoint, and Miami would essentially be stuck with that. Your strength of schedule would suffer because then you have to wonder if Florida State's in another conference, would Miami be able to keep them as a yearly member of their schedule? That's a big thing I wonder about. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Miami used to play Florida every year, and then, Florida decided that their, SEC schedule in the late 80s was too rigorous, so they took Miami off of their regular schedule. They did keep Florida State on, but I wouldn't want to lose Florida State from that regular schedule. So I would be very afraid. Like, as someone I'm a lifelong Miami fan and I've covered the program for many years, I would be very afraid of being left behind in a conference that would be leaps and bounds behind the SEC, the Big Ten, and then they'd also be behind the Big 12 at that standpoint if they were to lose Florida State. So Miami would be probably the fourth strong, or the ACC would be the fourth strongest conference at best. So, then there's just the question of, being able to get that bid. Now, I do think, I think the Miami TV market would be attractive. I think the Big Ten or SEC would want to be able to get the set. It's a top 15 market in America. They'd want to, potentially get that TV market involved. But I would be fully interested in making a jump. Whether or not Florida State leaves the ACC, I want out of the ACC.
I think you bring up two good points. The last one is the one you just made. It's just frustrating when you're trying to follow, whether you're a fan of Miami or not. Okay, what do they want to do? There's been zero, to my knowledge. I mean, there's political reasons for it, but I mean, every time you see one of these big name writers from ESPN, CBS, whatever network, we all know who they are. They always mention Miami. If Florida State leaves, well, here are the other teams. Miami's like the first one they mention every time, or it's second behind Clemson. It's depending on which article it is. So there's smoke there. They don't write that for fun.
True.
They lose their job if they write a bunch of BS about this because it's touchy legal stuff. They have to be a little more careful, and it's not just clickbait. Here's the other part with it. Miami, Florida State rivalry, which we will discuss a little bit later in this show, I think they would still find a way to do it, but is it the same? It wouldn't have the same meaning because you're not in the same like the way they're both recruiting. I think starting in 2025, definitively, and maybe even this year, the game can decide who wins the ACC title. And is like I'm sure everybody has seen by now, and I'll just announce it. They changed the platform again with the college football playoff that's getting ready to come up. It's 5-7 or whatever it is, but the conference champions all get it. Like if you win the conference, it's a top 4 bid or 5 now, I guess. That matters. Beating Florida State helps your strength of schedule and all that. So not only would you be in there if you're a Miami fan, like, oh, we beat them too, blah, 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 and vice versa for Florida State. All those things matter. The money part, though, let's not kid ourselves. It's the bottom line. Like for people that don't know, it's not coaches or ADs that vote on this. It's the presidents. Do you really think a lot of these presidents look at football the way Alex Donno and Brian Smith do?
Right. Probably not.
They look at it from a dollars and cents and from what's my legacy, et cetera, et cetera. Miami is a great institution in terms of academic prowess. It's always talked about trying to be kind of like Stanford or something like that. What would their game be? But here's my last question for you on this. And this is something that you and I have joked about, like when Stanford and Cal and even SMU joined the league. What in the hell would Miami's travel schedule be like for not just football players? Think about how far it is from just Tallahassee to Miami. It's a long way. How in the world do you navigate stuff like that? If you're a football coach, if you're the rowing, whatever, how hard do you think it would be? And this is one of the things that I would hope, at least, that coaches, athletic directors, and, of course, the president would think about. Like, what do you think that would be like for those players?
Well, I mean, it's bad on multiple fronts. I mean, I guess as of right now, like the SEC is the only one that's, maintaining some kind of geographical integrity because the Big Ten sold out their geography already. You got teams traveling out to Southern California and vice versa. The ACC obviously sold out their geographical integrity when you've got teams on the Pacific coast now in the Atlantic coast. It's a disaster. I'm glad you bring that up because a lot of times people only really think about football and basketball. Like people think about, the sports that get millions of viewers and are revenue generating sports. We don't think about the rowing teams and the golf teams and the tennis teams. And, they're the ones who get affected because the football teams are, fly charter or fly private. I don't think the tennis teams are flying on chartered and private jets around the country. So they're the ones who really suffer here. But, it's this crazy era we're in where college sports, specifically football and basketball to a lesser extent, it's not really amateur sports anymore. Like these are professional leagues. These are essentially minor leagues. That's what college football is now becoming. And it makes sense because the revenue being generated is astronomical. I mean, we all talk sometimes about this, the new video game that's going to be coming out. That's going to be EA Sports' most anticipated release, I think, in years. It's probably going to outperform most of the Madden games that have come out in recent years.
I think there's a chance for number one because wasn't Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, 2013 the last time they had a game? So technically that's 11 years just to build up from that. I mean, Madden's a huge game. I'm not taking, Madden Pro Football still trumps it in numbers, but 11 years, it might be number one. So
Yeah, it might be.
It's so exciting to think about all the different things with it. But that leads to something a little bit more fun, and that is talking about recruiting itself. We can talk about it in a perspective of, okay, does this change recruiting? I mean, I obviously follow recruiting as close as anybody. I travel all over the place. But what do you think? Do you think it would be easy? I mean, it's not hard to recruit to Miami. Let's start with the obvious. It's if you've ever been to Coral Gables or anything around it, it's not rocket science. Do you think it would be easier for the Canes if they were in the Big Ten or if they were in the SEC? I have some strong feelings about that, but I want your take on it as well.
Yeah, overall, yes. I think it's being in the best possible conference, I think, is much more of an advantage than it is disadvantage or anything else, because I think players, especially nowadays, they think about what teams will I be playing against, right? Am I going to be playing against Alabama? Am I going to be playing against Michigan and Ohio State, depending on which of the mega conferences you're in? Am I going to be playing in front of 110,000 people at the Big House? Am I going to be featured prominently on TV? Now, Miami does get on TV a lot, regardless of what conference they're in, but it's not quite the same thing as the exposure you get in, a big noon kickoff in the Big Ten or in one of these SEC primetime games. It's a whole different animal. And I think players appreciate that and understand that. It's not a generalization you can make for every player, because if everybody wanted to be in the SEC or the Big Ten, Miami and Florida State wouldn't be getting some of the high-profile players they've been getting. But I think for a lot of players, that does make a difference, because I have encountered this in recent years, occasionally covering recruiting for Miami, that sometimes you'll talk to a player that really, though, I like Miami, but I really want to be in the SEC, so they end up leaning more towards an Ole Miss or an Auburn or an Alabama more so than Miami. So it definitely does affect recruiting. Now, you talked about some of the things that a place like Miami has going for it. In the age of NIL, there's a lot of opportunities in South Florida, because you think about, there's obviously Miami's got a good collective right now, and there's a lot of private business entities that donate to that. It's a big market. There's a lot of money in the area. So the NIL opportunities have been good. And I think that when you're in a big city like this, when you're in a place like Miami or Los Angeles, there's not a whole lot of big city markets that are prominent in college football, but those are a couple of those. You have NIL opportunities in a place like Miami that you may not so easily have in certain other cities. So I think that makes it attractive as well. Even though obviously Miami's not been getting the results on the field consistently in recent years, as your audience well knows, I think this U does still have some brand power that is attractive to players. But overall, if you could get into one of those mega conferences, it can only help. It can't hurt.
I don't know if you remember this, but I remember telling you last year, and this was unsolicited. It really caught my attention because I'd always wondered about this topic. I went to IMG. They had a special day for all the recruiting media, and all kinds of people from all over the country came down. And TJ Lindsey was going to go to Auburn. He told me before he committed, hey, I'm going to go to Auburn. I was like, oh, cool. I would get a photo, blah, blah, blah. And we just started shooting the bull. And he said he picked Auburn over Miami because it was in the SEC.
Yeah.
Period.
There you go.
That was the reason. And I was like, holy moly. That really woke me up. Because, he's a top 200 kid by anybody's measurement. He's a player that IMG wanted badly to come down from Arkansas, and he's got a chance to eventually play in the NFL. Yeah, you can never have enough of those, especially up front on the D-line. So I think that Florida State and Miami, if they went to the SEC specifically, because obviously they're Southern teams, would gain. The Big Ten thing, I don't know, because there'd be some people being mad about the travel and the parents. I don't know how that goes. But the SEC specifically, I think it's a really difficult argument, because kids, if you look at the draft, and there's articles about this, how many kids came out of league X, Y, and Z? The SEC just destroys everybody else in the draft. I don't have the numbers pulled up, but trust me, it's 2-1 in certain spots, especially D-line and corner.
Yeah.
It's just, and those are, except for quarterback, those are the two most important spots. I think that Miami and Florida State and any school that has the opportunity, Clemson, North Carolina State, would probably be the others, I would assume. Clemson's been rumored a lot, just like the Canes. I think that you have to look at it just from that perspective. Now, again, you're trying to convince a president who doesn't look at things the same, but when you meet with him, if you're the AD, if you're the coach, your assistant coach, recruiting guys, all that. Like, look, we're going to win more, which is going to bring in more revenue, which is what you want. You're not going to talk about it publicly. But if we're just readily getting players because we're in a league, why wouldn't we consider it? And I think that's why Miami will want, just like you talked about earlier, I think that's why Miami will want to join Florida State and or Clemson and or NC State to join. I just don't know how those leagues would work because I'm trying to remember. I think the Big Ten is 18 teams right now going into this season. That's a lot. I forget what the SEC is, 15, 14, whatever. But like you're getting to the point, like I just don't want to be the guy that has to do the scheduling for that. But it's recruiting wise. If you look at the top 10 rankings, Miami has been one of them right there. And Florida State now, just this past class, got back into the mix being top 10 team. Half the teams are from the SEC in the top 10. Part of that is just the brand. And of course, some of them it's location, just like with Miami. It's not hard to recruit to UGA or LSU.
Well, and there's another layer to all this, though, this has been brought up. Some buzz from the Miami side when you think about a conference like the SEC, because obviously it's not just simply a matter of, hey, Miami would like to join the SEC. The SEC presidents have to vote to let them into the conference. Right. And one of the things, I mean, this is noticeable. Obviously, SEC powerhouse programs for the past couple of decades have loved coming down to South Florida. Sure. And taking area recruits. South Florida, Dade, Broward County, especially, are really rich recruiting grounds. And I've always heard rumblings that, hey, listen, one of the reasons why SEC presidents would probably prefer not to have Miami in the conference is when Miami's out of the SEC, it's much easier for SEC schools, whether it be the Bamas, the Auburns, Floridas, to go down to South Florida and take kids versus if Miami was in the conference, because they often use that as negative recruiting against Miami. Hey, why would you want to go to Miami? They're not in the SEC. You should come here and play big time football. They would lose that recruiting advantage over Miami if they let Miami into the conference.
There's a very similar part with that with Florida State. Even when Bowden was developing the program, and by 1980, Florida State was a national program, but you look at the late 80s through the early 2000s, they had a top 3 recruiting class almost like every single year. Oh. And one of the things they did, and they even did it this past year. They went into Georgia and took kids that were committed to UGA who had just won 2 national titles. Do you really think Kirby Smart would sign off on Florida State or Miami? Hell no. He was getting kids like, remember Tyreek went up to Georgia originally, then he transferred, stuff like that. There are guys that he's going to try to get, and it's easier, and Kirby's a great recruiter, but it's still easier for him, and it was for Saban. He used to murder South Florida. Oh, my gosh. Yeah. Saban not being in South Florida, and I've written about this in general for several different sites and talking about different podcasts, not having to recruit against Saban, it's got to be like one guy a year, at least for every school, because there are numerous, just look at how many kids they lost to the transfer portal because Nick left or retired. He's the greatest coach of all time, quite honestly, in my opinion. But it's hard to argue. So now, do you really think they want Florida State and Miami having more ability? Because Mario has done a really good job recruiting Georgia. He even got 2 kids out of the Mobile area this last year. That's as fertile as it gets per capita. So I think all of that glues together. I think there's no question about it. Last thing to talk about right now, Mr. Donno, is one that you and I have. One of the reasons we're both in this business. I grew up on the Miami and Florida State rivalry. I know you did as well. I want to talk about it. And first off, just give you the floor. What does the rivalry mean to you?
It means everything. And it's, to me, it's a rivalry of respect. It's not to say that I don't lose any sleep when Florida State loses games, and I celebrate. It hasn't happened in a few years, but I celebrate when Miami beats Florida State. But I've always had respect for Florida State, especially when you contrast it to a school like Florida. I'm still pretty bitter about the late 80s when they took Miami off of their regular schedule.
I'm not a big fan of that either.
Personally. It still grinds my gears to this day. With Florida State, and listen, they've both been in the ACC for about the last 19, 20 years. But even when Miami was in the Big East and Florida State was in the ACC, it's always been a regular yearly rivalry. And, a lot of respect for some former Florida State coaches. Bobby Bowden, I really, really respected him to this day. Jimbo Fisher, not as much, but probably your audience would agree on some of that. So
there's some truth there. Yes.
So I just think about, first of all, great players on both sides that have come through that rivalry and the amazing moments, Brian. I mean, I grew up. It was right around 1990, late 80s. I was born in 84. So when I started to really appreciate the rivalry was right around 90, 91. And I'm thinking about these wide rights and then the wide left in 2002. I'm thinking about Gino Torretta. I'm thinking about Michael Irvin. And some of my favorite moments going to some of the games, Brian, was 2000, which I think was wide right 3, but I think about it as the Dorsey to Jeremy Shockey comeback win under the sweltering heat in Miami was absolutely incredible. A couple years later in 2002, Florida State had a big lead. Willis McGahee took the top off Florida State's defense with a screen pass. Miami was able to win that game off of the wide left that Florida State missed late in that one. Oh man, it's just the build up to this game, Brian, and I've been to so many of them down in South Florida, and I hope to go to some future ones in Tallahassee. I didn't get down to the one this past year, which ended up being a close game. I love when it's a close game first and foremost, because obviously there have been some blowouts. Florida State blew Miami's doors off a couple of years ago. Miami had a blowout win over Florida State the COVID year. I prefer when the games are close because it always gets testy with the fan bases. A lot of Florida State fans live in South Florida. A lot of them travel down to that game. I know Florida State fans like to call it Doak South, but it's like maybe 60-40 Miami fans when Florida State comes to town, and you see the fights in the parking lot. You see people chanting and going crazy out there. But man, and when I used to go to games, Brian, when I was a student at Miami, I'd go to games in the student section. I remember when Frank Gore pulled off a touchdown in overtime to win a game on Labor Day night. And there were a couple of Florida State fans who were sitting in the student section, and we were heckling them like crazy when that happened. Very brave. Very well. I think it was. I think it was the Miami students who grew up Florida State fans, and so they were sitting in the student section. But we gave them absolute hell, no violence or anything, but the heckling was out of control, man. So it's something. Obviously, when they used to play in the Orange Bowl Stadium, it just meant a little more to me because that building was so special. But even at Hard Rock Stadium, it's always a capacity crowd for that game. At Doak, it's always a capacity crowd, and it's the game you circle on the schedule each and every year. And you mentioned it earlier. I love the fact that, obviously Florida State comes off a tremendous year, and I thought they were hard done by the playoff committee. I thought they should have been in the college football playoff. Not that I would have expected them to, win without Jordan Travis, but I thought they should have gotten in. Florida State obviously has had a much better team than Miami over the last couple of years, but I think Miami is on the way up. And that game this year could decide future ACC champion, or they could even be the first of two if Miami and Florida State still end up top 2 in the ACC. But there's going to be a lot on the line in this year's game, and I absolutely cannot wait for it.
I think so too. This could be the best one in quite a while. Last year's game had some different kind of drama, like the defenses played probably a little better in different situations, the whole Emory Williams thing. But for me, when I remember seeing Florida State, Miami, there were good games, bad games, sometimes it's a blowout, whatever. But usually the last 5 minutes of that game, somebody that ended up playing in the NFL made a play for Team A or Team B. The Noles or the Canes, one of them. And that's what I would remember. There were so many of those games, like 91, 92, the wide right. Then in 93, Florida State, they get the field goal kicker comes in, they finally get, and they get a title, blah, blah, blah. There was just so many little shots between the two teams. And it was just incredible. Because it's ironic that their rises were simultaneously too. Again, a lot of people don't remember, but 1980, Florida State had a great team, and they were like right there at the end, towards the end of the season, to be a team in the national title. In Miami, that's when they kind of got it rolling too. At that same time, then in '83, they got their first title. Everything just lines up. So no matter what happens with the grant of rights, this is a rivalry game, in my opinion. And I'll speak for you. Needs to happen. I know that you're not going to argue with that. I know you well enough. So let's hope that it does. And it's a great thing for college athletics, college football. So I appreciate it. Sir, where can all the people find your work?
Well, I appreciate it. And of course, for those who enjoy watching Brian, he's a frequent guest on Locked On Canes talking recruiting. So you can check us out at Locked On Canes. And we do have some Florida State fans who come in and troll us every day. So we are familiar with the fan base at Locked On Canes. You can find us on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find me on X, the app formerly known as Twitter, at Locked On Canes. And if you follow us, we will follow you back.
I appreciate it, sir. Thank you to everybody that came in and checked it out today. Please subscribe. Please like and share this podcast. We will be back again very soon. Thank you all. Have a great day.